Hello and welcome to the second video in a series discussing Chapter 6 of Government in America. We're talking about public opinion and political action, and in this video we're going to focus on polling. Public opinion polling is a very important part of how politics is conducted in this time period. A poll is basically a survey of a small percentage of a population in order to try and get a good estimate of what the entire population thinks. There are over 300 million people in America. There are tens of millions of voters. There's no way that you can ask them all repeatedly over the course of a few months or a year what they think about issues. And from what we know about people and how people work is you don't really need to ask everybody if you're looking for a good estimate. You can ask a good sized sample of the population, and that'll give you a rough idea of what the population overall thinks. Think of it like you've got a pie, and you take a slice of the pie and you take a bite of the slice of the pie. At that point, maybe you eat one bite, two bites, three bites. You start coming to some conclusions about what the pie is like. What is it, an apple or is it a blueberry pie? Is it, uh, is it overdone or underdone? Does it have good flavor or bad flavor? You come to these conclusions without having to eat the entire pie before you can come to a conclusion. You took a sample, you then extrapolated and said, hey, what I think about this sample is probably true of the entire thing, and you go from there. If you liked the first slice of pie, you'll probably go back and try and get a second slice of pie. If you don't like the slice of pie that you're eating, you're probably not going to want to go back and get another one because you're going to expect that it tastes the same. So the trick here in polling is, what does that sample look like? Are we getting a sample? Are we getting a bite of the pie that really does resemble the rest of the pie? And that is the trick. And that is what makes polling work historically, but it's also what's presenting more and more challenges to pollsters in the 21st century for a variety of reasons. Okay? You need the biggest thing that you need to have with your sample is that it should be representative. It should resemble the whole that you're trying to sample, that you're trying to draw conclusions about. If all you did with that pie was take a little bit of the crust and taste that, you might say, oh, there's no fruit at all in this, because you haven't gotten a representative sample. You haven't taken a bite that has all of the parts of the pie in it. Just taking that little bit of crust is not a representative sample. And you need to have a representative sample if you want to have confidence that your survey is a good one. So what this means is, generally speaking, percentage-wise, the sample of people that you talk to ought to resemble proportionally the overall population. If the overall population of the country is, let's say, around 51% female, you want your sample to be as close to that as possible. You want your sample to roughly match in terms of religious background, racial and ethnic identity, sexual orientation, age, all party identification, all these factors. You want to try and get your sample to be as close to what we, figure America as a whole looks like, in order to make sure that your sample is good. Now, one of the ways that pollsters, especially in America, have tried to make sure that they have a representative sample is to use random sampling techniques. They don't for example, say, all right, I'm going to go to this neighborhood in Philadelphia and I'm going to knock on every single door in this neighborhood, and that's how I'm going to try and get my sample. That would be bad because one particular neighborhood probably is going to have more of one type of person than another, and it's not going to look like the overall city, state, or country. If you instead pick people at random, you're much likelier to get that mix that looks like the entire population. And the biggest way that pollsters have done this is using telephones. You randomly dial numbers, and so by randomly dialing numbers, you're not chunking people into any particular group. You're not using any preconceptions or pre-screening. You're really trying to make sure that you're getting a wide a range of people. Now, even if your sample is representative, even if you've done your job right, more than likely your sample is not going to exactly replicate what the entire country is like. Let's go back to the pie example. Maybe the oven's a little uneven, so one part of the pie got baked a little bit more than the rest of the pie. Or, not every single apple, was exactly the same quality or exactly the same flavor. Little variations happen, and that's okay. But you got to be aware of this. You can't say, well, 51% of my sample said this, so 51% of Americans must say the same thing. No, there's got to be some wiggle room. And pollsters recognize this, and they are able to kind of determine, based on what they know about how polling works, based on how many people they contacted and things like that. They say, all right, there is some sampling error in this. We need a little bit of leeway on either side of the number that we're putting out here. And the pollsters measure this sampling error by talking about a margin of error. So they'll say that the margin of error in this poll is plus or minus 2 points. That means that whatever number we're telling you, the correct answer might be up to 2 higher or up to 2 lower. It's actually more of a range than a specific number that we're giving you. So you just kind of have to make sure that you're aware of that. Now, besides having a representative sample, there are other qualities that you should look for in a good poll. The sample should be a large enough size. For a population like the United States, you'd ideally like to talk to definitely several hundred, maybe a few thousand people. The fewer people you talk to, the more room for distortion there is in the poll. We've already talked about the importance of the representative sample. The questions that are asked in the poll are very important. So pollsters do tend to report exactly what questions they've asked. You want the questions to be clear so that the people who are responding don't get confused. You want them to be fair so that they're not saying, if you were doing an opinion poll for a political race, if you were to say, do you support war hero Bob or puppy kicker Tom? Well, now the way the question is phrased is, kind of skewing people and pushing people to answer in a certain way. And you don't want to do that in a poll. If what you're trying to accomplish with the poll is finding out what people actually think. And you also have to be aware that, it's people have reactions to being polled, and the way that the question gets asked affects the way that they answer. And so a good pollster takes that into account and tries to adjust for those sorts of things. Here's one example. There is a noticeable tendency for, if you give people a list of options, people will just answer the first one that they hear. It sticks in their head, and it just becomes the one that they answer. So if you always put the same answer first in your list, then you might overestimate how many people actually agree with that answer versus how many people answered that way because it was the first thing you said. So a good pollster will rotate. If they're asking about 3 candidates, sometimes you put candidate A first, sometimes candidate B, other times candidate C. That way you rotate it. That way you're kind of accounting for the way people think and the way people respond. Okay. Now, these days, like I said, polling is getting harder, and there's some debate over whether polls are being over relied on and that they're not giving us an accurate idea. As more people get cell phones and drop their landlines, that random dialing that I talked about before gets harder to do. And so people have to spend more money to call the cell phones, and that creates an obstacle for getting the polls to be done the way that they want to. People are getting tired of politics and upset with politics, and they just don't want to answer questions about it. And also people are kind of more in the know about polls, and so sometimes they'll lie just to try to get a certain message across. They won't answer the way that they're actually going to behave. They'll answer in the way that they think sends a good message to the public or get some other point across. So pollsters around the world, have noticed that, wow, we haven't really nailed these elections, especially the way we thought we would, and it's leading to a little bit of a crisis of confidence. So that's something to keep aware of. When you see someone report a poll number and they say 52% of Americans think this, take it with a salt shaker, okay? Because it's better information than nothing, but it might have some gaps. Now, finally, I just want to say a few things about what are polls used for. One thing that polls might be used for is you ask the people what they think about an issue, and then elected officials do what the public thinks. I wish that were how it happened more frequently, but it doesn't always turn out that way. What sometimes happens is that the elected officials will take polls to say, hey, I already want to do this. What's the phrasing or the message that I have to use that'll make people like it? If I describe this as a tax cut, is that better than describing it as a investment program? And so politicians use polls to try and figure out the best way to talk about what they already want to do. And the media will use polls to try to frame how they talk about things. We're in 2016 right now, and the presidential primaries have sort of been going on for a while, and a lot of networks have used polls to try and figure out which candidates they're going to cover in more detail. So these are ways that polls influence things. Finally, we can say a few things about the American people based on what we know from polls. One thing that polls report is that a lot of Americans don't really know a lot about politics and government. When pollsters ask questions about who's in charge or who has this job or things like that, a lot of Americans just don't know the answer. The things that we do know about the government, we tend not to like because trust in government and politics has gone down considerably since the 1960s for a variety of reasons. Now, in the next video in this series, we'll talk about the different ways that people take action on their beliefs. Until then, I leave you with these questions for further thought.